The heat emanating from the mouth of the 13-inch bronze mortar distorts the heavy air of the trenches, while the master gunner brings the glowing fuse close to the ear of the piece. There is no margin for error when 50 kilograms of black powder are compressed into a chamber of molten metal under extreme pressure. The dry crack of ignition precedes a detonation that not only deafens the men nearby, but shakes the damp soil of Europe, turning the oak wood platform into a creaking structure that struggles not to splinter under the recoil of 5 tons. The projectile, a hollow iron sphere filled with explosives and shrouded in sulfurous smoke, describes a slow and visible parabola against the gray sky. Unlike direct-fire cannons, the mortar does not seek frontal impact. It defies gravity to fall vertically, transforming potential energy into a kinetic hammer aimed at breaching the roofs of bunkers and ammunition depots. The smell of sulfur invades the soldiers' lungs, mingling with the odor of sweat and disturbed earth, while all eyes track the black arc carrying the fate of the enemy fortification. Operating a machine like this is an exercise in faith. You light the fuse and hope the bronze does not decide to shatter into shrapnel in your face. It is luck similar to that of those navigating here. One day you find a rare historical record. The next, the algorithm kicks you into a forgotten trench. If you prefer to be on the side that understands the mechanics of destruction rather than being hit by it, consider clicking the subscribe button. It's the only way to ensure that the next shot from this forge reaches you before the smoke covers everything. After all, in 1740, no one wanted to miss the next angle of fire, and neither should you. If the bronze alloy had any invisible microcracks to the human eye, this would be the moment the mortar would transform into a giant grenade, killing all operators within a radius of 20 meters. The life of a gunner in the 18th century is a constant gamble against imperfect metallurgy and unstable chemistry. When the thick white smoke begins to dissipate, the silence that follows is merely the prelude to the impact, a gap of seconds where pure physics replaces human will, and iron begins its work of grinding what engineering took decades to build. Bringing down a fortress in the 18th century requires less brute force and far more applied trigonometrics than a modern observer might assume. On the oak tables of the headquarters, maps stained with candle grease reveal the ruthless geometry of the bastions and moats, where each angle of fire is calculated to avoid the lateral defenses. The gunner does not look at the wall, but at the space behind it, seeking the exact point where the bomb's parabola will strike the ground at an angle of 70 degrees, ensuring that the projectile buries itself deeply before detonating. Ballistic calculation is a dance between the weight of the projectile and the propellant charge, where every gram of added powder alters the drop curve by precious meters. The manuals of the time treat the trajectory as an elegant abstraction, but in the field, reality is made of mud and parallax error. To hit a supply depot hidden behind 30 meters of earth and stone, the artillery officer needs to convert the measured distance into paces for the exact elevation on the quadrant, knowing that a deviation of 2 degrees will result in a waste of resources that the empire took months to finance. Air resistance, a factor still technically misunderstood but felt empirically, slows the iron sphere, causing the actual arc to always be shorter than the theoretical. This discrepancy between Galileo's theory and the physical resistance of the atmosphere transforms the siege into a science of continuous correction, where the first shot is almost always an informational sacrifice. Success is not measured by the brightness of the explosion, but by the rhythmic precision with which subsequent shots begin to undermine the structural integrity of the enemy's hidden foundations. The black powder that fuels these iron monsters is a whimsical mixture of refined saltpeter, sulfur, and lightwood charcoal produced in mills where the slightest carelessness results in total disaster. In the 18th century, the quality of the saltpeter defines the power of the explosion. If poorly purified, The moisture residue will prevent quick ignition, turning the shot into a weak puff that lets the bomb fall dangerously close to the trench itself. The men handling the barrels do so with nail-less leather shoes, fearing that a single static spark between the metal and the ground will end the siege prematurely. The loading process is a ritual of mechanical precision carried out under enemy fire, where the gunner introduces the propellant charge into canvas bags to ensure that no grain disperses through the sole of the piece. If the powder is not compacted with the correct pressure, the burn will be uneven, causing a variation in exit velocity that renders all previously made geometric calculations useless. Sweat drips down the faces darkened by soot, and the bitter taste of potassium nitrate saturates the mouth of anyone breathing the fine powder that floats in the saturated air of the batteries. Each shot consumes an amount of resources that could sustain an entire village for a year. The economic cost of keeping a mortar battery active forces military command to demand immediate results. There is no room for waste in an era where the transport of each barrel of powder relies on oxen caravans crossing impassable, muddy roads. The logistics of destruction is, above all, a matter of chemical purity and discipline in handling a substance that longs to consume everything around it in an instant of light and pressure. Moreover, staying alive in an 18th century artillery battery required as much attention as not losing the thread of this narrative. If you made it this far without being hit by a miscalculation or an unstable barrel of powder, congratulations. You survived the dirtiest part of the siege. But to understand how this chemical fury turns into mathematical precision, you will need to subscribe to the channel. Think of it as your safe conduct in the trench. Without the click on the subscription, you risk the algorithm considering you a civilian target and leaving you lost in the historical mud. Click there before the next load of saltpeter explodes. To convert the fury of powder into a surgical impact, the 18th century gunner relies on a polished brass instrument known as a quadrant. This device, a square-shaped rod with a graduated arc and a plumb line, is inserted directly into the mouth of the mortar. The silence in the battery is absolute, while the officer adjusts the piece's elevation. He watches the silk thread sway until gravity aligns it, perfectly with the 45-degree mark, the theoretical angle for maximum range. Precision here is measured in fractions of an inch in the wooden wedge that supports the metal, as any millimetric slip in the support base will translate into dozens of meters of error in the final destination. Behind the officer, the assistant consults handwritten firing tables, protected from moisture by tanned leather covers. In these pages, the experience of decades of war is distilled into numbers that correlate the weight of the iron bomb with the exact amount of pounds of powder. It is not just about inclination, but about understanding the density of the air and the slope of the terrain. The wind blowing against the plume of the gunner's hat is the invisible enemy. He knows that a lateral gust can push the projectile off its parabolic trajectory, turning a master shot into a useless impact against the soft earth of the ditch. The brass tool is the only link of reason in an environment dominated by sound chaos and destruction. While infantry soldiers rely on luck and volume of fire, the gunner trusts geometry. He adjusts the sight screws with calloused fingers, ignoring the whistling of musket balls passing over the trench. The quadrant is not just a measuring instrument. It is the tool that transforms the gunner into an architect of ruin, allowing him to visualize the invisible curve that will connect the mouth of the cannon to the heart of the enemy. The firing of a mortar involves a timing coordination that borders on the ritualistic, centered on the fuse of the bomb itself. Before being hoisted into the tube, the iron sphere receives a lime wood fuse, perforated and filled with a slow-burning composition. The master artilleryman needs to cut this fuse with a sharp knife to the exact length, based on the calculated flight time. If the cut is too long, the bomb will hit the target and remain inert for precious seconds, allowing the enemy to extinguish the wick. If it is too short, it will explode in the air, scattering shrapnel harmlessly against the clouds. The moment of loading is the peak of nervous tension. Weighing the same as an adult man, the bomb is lowered by hemp ropes over the projection charge, while an artilleryman keeps the fuse of the wick facing outward. In many cases, the double-fire method is used. First, the fuse of the bomb is ignited, and 1 second later, the mortar charge. The risk of the piece failing while the bomb is already with the wick lit inside the tube is the nightmare of every officer, a countdown to collective suicide that requires nerves of steel to navigate. The glow of the slow fuse, a vibrant orange dot in the twilight of battle, is the death timer. The smell of burnt rope and saltpeter floats in the air while the fire command is awaited. There is a technical and brutal intimacy in this process. The man who ignites the wick feels the heat of the metal and the vibration of the ground beneath his feet. When the order finally echoes, the match touches the ear of the piece, and physics takes control, leaving behind men holding their breath, mentally counting the seconds until the horizon is torn apart by a burst of fire. When the bomb finally completes its parabola and finds the ceiling of a gun emplacement, the physics of the collision is devastating. The weight of almost 100 kilograms of iron, accelerated by the gravity of a fall from hundreds of meters, possesses enough kinetic energy to penetrate layers of bricks and compacted earth even before the chemical detonation. The sound of the initial impact is a dull roar, almost instantly followed by an internal explosion that projects molten iron fragments in all directions. These shards are not uniform. They are irregular and serrated pieces that tear through flesh and wood with equal ease. Inside the fortifications, the effect is claustrophobic and lethal. The shock wave of a 13-inch bomb in a confined space is capable of crushing the lungs of the defenders and bursting eardrums, even if they are not struck by the iron. The dust of lime and smoke from the explosion transform the tunnels into choking chambers. The purpose of the mortar is not only to bring down walls, but to destroy the will to resist, turning the safest refuge into a debris trap. The effectiveness of the ammunition lies in its ability to transform the very defensive structure into a weapon against those who occupy it. At dawn, the impact site resembles a lunar crater amidst the architectural order of the fortress. Half-meter-thick oak beams are reduced to sticks, and the earth is turned over as if by a giant plow. The economy of the 18th century dictates that stone is expensive, but life is abundant. However, the mortar inverts this logic by making stone irrelevant. Each open crater is a testament to the victory of ballistics over static engineering, a visceral proof that no stronghold can withstand indefinitely against the weight of iron measured by mathematics. The movement of a siege mortar battery is an engineering nightmare that consumes the energies of entire provinces. To move a single piece of 13 inches and its respective oak platform, 36 draft horses or 60 oxen are needed, advancing along roads that the autumn rain has turned into channels of deep mud. The dominant sound is not that of military march, but the crack of whips and the excruciating creaking of wooden axles yielding under the weight of 5 tons of bronze. Every kilometer conquered represents a Herculean effort where animals die of exhaustion and soldiers bury their shoulders in the wheels to prevent the valuable metal from being swallowed by the swamp. Behind each piece follows an endless convoy of wagons loaded with the sustenance of destruction. Barrels of gunpowder protected by wool blankets to avoid sparks and piles of iron bombs that overload the suspensions. The logistics of the siege is a mathematical account of constant consumption. A single day of intense bombardment can deplete what took weeks to transport. If the supply of gunpowder is interrupted by a rear attack or by a bridge collapsing under the weight of the load, the siege dies of technical starvation, leaving the mortars as useless and silent giants before the walls. In the trenches, the work does not end with the arrival of the pieces. The sappers need to dig perfectly level platforms, for a mortar fired over unstable ground can topple or bury its base, making the aim impossible. The environment is an ecosystem of sweat, damp earth, and the acrid smell of wet leather from the animals. The grandeur of artillery, so celebrated in the palaces, is born here, in the brutality of physical effort and in the mud that covers uniforms and maps, proving that ballistic science is, above all, a science of transportation and muscular endurance. At the apex of its trajectory, hundreds of meters above the ground, the iron bomb finds its final judge, the atmosphere. The 18th-century artilleryman, although devoid of electronic sensors, instinctively understands that the air is not a vacuum, but a dense fluid that resists motion. The lateral wind, invisible in the depths of the trench, can push the projectile several meters, enough for it to fall harmlessly into a water ditch instead of hitting the ammunition depot. The humidity of the air also alters the density of the gunpowder and the speed of combustion, forcing the master gunner to constantly readjust his calculations between the high noon shot and the midnight one. The irregularity of the surface of the cast bombs creates turbulence that makes the flight unpredictable. No iron sphere is perfectly symmetrical. Small air bubbles trapped during casting displace the center of gravity, causing the bomb to wobble in the air like a dry leaf in the midst of a storm. The artillery officer observes these deviations with a mix of frustration and reverence, noting in his diary how nature seems to conspire against geometric precision. The perfect shot is a rarity, a fortuitous alignment between the quality of the metal, the purity of the chemistry, and the momentary truce of the air currents. The frustration of missing a target after hours of preparation is a heavy psychological blow. The cost of each failed shot is measured in pounds sterling and in lives lost in the delay of the siege. When the resistance of the wind overcomes the mathematics of the quadrant, the battery plunges into a frantic activity of correction. The load is increased, the elevation angle is altered, and prayers are said that the next burst does not deflect the iron. It is a struggle of intelligence against climatic chaos, where man tries to impose his will over the sky through brass instruments and logarithmic tables. When the last mortar of the battery falls silent, the silence that descends upon the battlefield is more deafening than the detonations. The fog of gunpowder dissipates slowly, revealing a landscape where the order of military architecture has been replaced by a topography of chaos and ruin. The walls, once proud and geometric, are now piles of broken stones and turned earth, where the smell of death mingles with the odor of lime dust and persistent smoke. The success of the bombardment is visible in the black smoke rising from the burning depots, a sign that the economy of the enemy's resistance has collapsed. The human and financial cost of such destruction is incalculable. The rebuilding of a fortress struck by 13-inch mortars would take decades and the treasure of a nation, making surrender often the only rational economic decision. The artillery officer cleans the quadrant and gathers his tables, aware that his science has not only toppled stones, but has ended a chapter of local history. Victory is not celebrated with music, but with the rhythmic sound of the sappers' picks, who already begin to plan the occupation of the rubble. In the end, what remains is the testimony of ballistic effectiveness. The hollow iron fulfilled its purpose of crushing stone and flesh. The 18th century moves toward its end, leaving behind the lessons that war is an equation of pressures and trajectories. As the survivors emerge from the destroyed casemates, the mortars, now cold, remain on their platforms like bronze sentinels awaiting the next conflict where mathematics will again be invoked to turn cities into ashes and silence. The master gunner wipes the soot from his eyes, observing the heavy silence that settles where the architecture of a fortress once pulsed. The mathematics of death has fulfilled its role. Iron crushed stone, and what remains is merely the accounting of a crumbling empire. If you survive this technical siege and do not want to become lost in the mud of history, ensure your registration. Navigating here without being in the channel is like attempting to fire a mortar in the dark without quadrant or compass. We now guard the brass and the fuses, for while the dust settles, the forge already begins to heat the metal for the next shot.